this book, I was one of 3 finalists, and the category Excellence in Publishing is a focus on the visual of the book, or the publishing, or something like that, not necessarily the writing or the content otherwise. And so as you'll see, this is a highly designed book with all kinds of imagery and whatnot in it. And I like to start actually with the cover, and people are seeing that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you will note the cod up in the left-hand corner. Leslie Moore, poet and printmaker, did that for me as a pen and ink. And I had wanted an image of a codfish that I was going to use throughout the book. But I, as you can imagine, there's lots of images of codfish out there, but they're all look dead, or they're all dead, the specimen kind of things. So I wanted one that looked alive, and she did this pen and ink for me. And that guy shows up frequently throughout the book. The rest of the cover is a painting by Sheep Jones. Some of you might be familiar with her. She's based in Belfast. And it was a little 4x4 painting that I had bought probably about 5 years ago, because it really called to me, and I thought it said something I was trying to say or do about the North Atlantic. And so I thought it worked perfect, because I'm on both sides of the Atlantic, and really that could be in Maine, it could be a rebuild in Ireland, it could be in Scotland. So I thought it spoke in that kind of way. So my little crazy obsession here that got to be about codfish is part of this larger thing I'm calling the North Atlantic Rim Project, which is very loose, which means I get to do whatever I want. So I'm seeing this as sort of the first installment. The next installment will be, and we'll show that later, will be an installation project that I hope to have in libraries or town halls up and down the coast. And so, there may or may not be another book out of this, or it could be just a book of poetry or whatever. I'm just letting it see how it evolves. And it is a hybrid of poetry, essay, and fiction. And the way I got to that combination was I had a lot of this material floating around. So this has been something I've wanted to do, this North Atlantic Rim Project, probably for a decade. It was one of those conversations you would have, and maybe not too much would happen as a result of it. But really all along, I was doing this traveling to Newfoundland. Certainly I've been in Maine for 50 years, over to Scotland, and I've been in Portugal, and Portugal was a major factor in the cod industry in the 1500s, and they are still the country that buys and eats the most salted cod. Bacalhau, it's called. Most of it coming now from Iceland, where I just got back from. So I had some poems, and I had some kind of half stories, and I was just sort of mulling around, what was I actually going to make out of this? And as time went by, I was accumulating more, and I was thinking of it as a book in some kind of way. Now, a mixed genre book is a little hard to sell, and it's in a lot of different kinds of ways, or actually to figure out how to organize it. So I went through many different, probably 4 or 5 serious ways to organize this book. And I was thinking of it chronologically, or I was thinking of it by place. And finally, I settled on it by genre. One of the problems with maybe, let's say, doing chronologically or by place is that people needed a lot of information to get some of the material. So the first part is the essays. The other thing I knew I really, really needed was a map. And how is this going to work? Mike,
Well, the Zoom people are seeing on this camera here, this
okay.
here. So if you hold it up.
Okay,
they
great,
should be able to
great. And I needed a map that really gave that perspective of the connection between both sides of the Atlantic. And I found this in the Osher Library down in Portland. And as you can see, it's an old one. It's from 1774. It's a map of really the British colonies in that era. And the whole map went all the way down into the Caribbean. And that becomes an important part of this story too. But you can see that it's, here is Great Britain. It's kind of a hop, just a hop across the water, especially considering the prevailing winds. Now the Basques, right in here, this is the Bay of Biscay. They were the first ones to discover the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. And on this map, they're calling it the Great Fishing Bank right here, but it's they were the first ones to discover it. And of course, this was during the era when the Catholic Church was very, very important, and their rituals and requirements were very important, including there were very many meatless days. And some of us grew up in a time when that was still going on, and there were always kids at school who couldn't eat. We had fish sticks on Friday, right? Because that was one of the meatless days. So there was a huge market for this fish, and they were flooding the market in Europe, and everyone else was saying, where's this fish coming from? It's big, there's a lot of it. Eventually, about 100 years later, the Portuguese figured it out, and they started fishing over there. So again, if you look, here we have Portugal. It's really because of prevailing winds. It just takes you right up there. Does that work? Is that working?
Yeah, I think if you looked at, or if I move the microphone a little. So
okay.
It's not.
There would be about 50 something a schooner plus the crew. And when they would get over there, they stayed on the banks for the whole season. And every morning they would drop a dory with the man in it and the bucket of bait and hooks over the side. And the man would, sometimes there were two men in a boat, would row away from the boat, sometimes quite far out of sight, in order to fill their dory. So that was the standard for a long time. And even here in what became the United States, you might have heard of bankers, bank schooners. And that was the last, I think it went out of commission in the 1950s. So I thought it was important that I started with a fish, because that's the cause of the whole thing. I'm going to take a little sip of water, and then I'm going to read. And I'll show the picture. I'm going to make a slideshow someday, right? And this is what my designer, Lori Harley, who was really instrumental in this whole thing, put together. Sudden spring. It starts with an explosion. Trillions of phytoplankton burst onto the scene in the cold North Atlantic on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and George's Bank. As many as 12 million in a gallon of water, they split their single-cell bodies, doubling in number every 2 or 3 days. Needing the warmth and light of the sun, they linger within 100 feet of the surface in various shapes. The bloom can be seen from space. Year after year, during a cold and rough spring, as the length of the days increases, these modest plants trigger almost the whole of the North Atlantic's spawning and growing season. Above 44 degrees latitude, they are the foundation of the food chain. Slightly larger copepods eat them, as do the larvae of crabs, lobster, herring, and mackerel. Jellyfish love them. Even ground fish swarm up from the bottom to feed at this time of the year. The most voracious of these is the cod, the fish with the thin curled whiskers where a chin would be. And the end of that. These fishing grounds and the land that edges them have been hotly contested since the 15th century. For over 600 years, this homely predator has brought fishermen from across the globe, Basque, Portuguese, English, Spanish, French, Irish, spawning a whole new world. And that really was the impetus on the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s in that part of the world, less so in what became the United States. People were coming over for other kinds of reasons. All right, got the fish. Now what am I doing? And I felt that I needed an essay that brought it all together, that sort of rationalized what I was doing and laid the groundwork. And that's the first essay I call Bearings. And I'm just going to read a couple little excerpts from it to give you a sense of this whole thing. And I do have to tell you that this is me on Miami Beach. I'm from away. I wasn't born in Maine, so I'm someone from away, a flatlander, despite the fact I lived here for most of my life, 46 years at this writing. Even though I raised a son here on Midcoast, Maine, worked as a waitress, horse logger, and window washer, earned my 3 college degrees in Maine, worked my professional lives as an editor, teacher, social worker, planted and replanted multiple gardens, scattered the ashes of my mother, brother, stepfather, and husband in Penobscot Bay, I will forever be from away. I accept this. Where I grew up, Satellite Beach, Florida on the Space Coast, incorporated 1957, I didn't know anyone who wasn't from someplace else. The heyday of the space industry brought people, mostly white, from all over the country in post-war Germany to work at Cape Canaveral. And a little later on, I say, when I'm in Newfoundland, I come from away. In 1962, when I first read about the discovery of the Vikings' presence at Lanso Meadows on Newfoundland, I heard the call of the North. I heard it again about the same time when I read the Weekly Reader Book Club biography of Amelia Earhart. She took off from her first solo transatlantic flight from Harbor Grace, a centuries-old fishing port on Conception Bay in Newfoundland. My interest in the North is not the far north of year-round snow and ice, but rather that above 44 degrees north latitude, the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, southern Labrador, the western Scottish Islands. The call is from rocks and sky and a heavier sea than the Gulf Stream of Florida. It is wildflowers and impenetrable brush and ghosts. The call has something to do with fortitude, persevering in spite of adversity, and coming into a warm house from the cold. At 44.4259 degrees north, my home in Belfast, Maine, has some of that, but it's not north enough. Farther are the Orkneys, Shetlands, Faroes, and Iceland. In Gaelic Scotland, I am un fa off, one from away. I learned the translation in a pub in Ullapool on the northwest coast. My traveling friend and I had popped in for a pint and maybe some fresh fish, and the place was packed. We put aside our American squeamishness of invading a stranger's personal space and our fear of being seen as pushy Americans and squeezed into the Half Moon booth. We were greeted with nods and tipped glasses all around. And that's where I learned Ian Far Naf, because one of our booth mates was an older man from the Orkneys, which are the string of islands just north of Scotland, as opposed to the Hebrides, which are west of Scotland mainland, and the Shetland, which are the farther up. So he was from Orkney. He had owned a string of of department stores around the islands. And I said, this whole thing about come from away and from away. Is there anything like that here? And he wrote it out for me, in fa'af, one from away. So I got interested in this topic. I used to be an editor for National Fisherman magazine, which was originally based here right on Elm Street, and then relocated to Rockland, and now they're out of Portland. And I was Atlantic and Gulf editor, so my beat ran from Brownsville, Texas to Newfoundland. And I went up there for a trip, and it was right on the eve of the cod moratorium. And the cod moratorium, which I'll just read on here. On my first trip to Newfoundland, I was Atlantic and Gulf editor for the commercial fishing magazine, National Fisherman, and the island was part of my beat. It was the eve of the Canadian cod moratorium in 1992, when the Canadian government banned cod fishing along its east coast to help restore the stocks that had been depleted due to overfishing from foreign and Canadian trawlers. This moratorium ended nearly 500 years of cod fishing in Newfoundland and Labrador, and everyone was struggling to understand the implications. So this is what Newfoundland was about, cod fishing. There's some lumbering and things like that, and it was all closed down. And the same a similar kind of thing happened on George's Bank, which belongs to the Americans. Most of it belongs to the Americans. Some of it belongs to the Canadians. But the Grand Banks is the Canadian Newfoundland. So this was a huge change. A decade later, I was back on the island for a vacation and had a larger glimpse. During my travels, I learned more about salted cod production from earlier days and the way cod was handled and shipped in their international trade from the 17th to early 20th centuries. And what a production it was, relying on the work of women and children on the beaches for the heavy labor processing the fish on the flakes after it was ashore. So as one Newfoundland fisherman says, we's catch 'em and the women's make 'em. So the women's made the fish. They would be gutted, headed, everything else taken out, flayed open, and then they would be brined in a barrel. And everybody had their own brine kind of recipe. After a certain amount of time, probably about a week, they would be taken out and they'd be laid out on the beach, either on the shingle, which would be all rock beach, or something that it was a raised thing, which was more of a platform. And they would be laid out every morning and turned over a couple times during the day. If the weather looked threatening, they came out and took them all back and piled them up again. And then as soon as the weather cleared, they went back out. So this was the women's work during the heavy part of the season, which would have been probably from about May, maybe into November. So a lot of, kind of work. So I was interested not just in the fish, but also in the women's work that created it. And I learned more about that. So, this seems like a kind of a nerdy little project. I like information and I actually wrote poems based on this kind of thing. But before I read a poem, so I have to tell you the important thing about this. So this book, although it does represent multiple communities, was mostly centered on Newfoundland, because Newfoundland was the salt trade for about 400 years. And some of the salt cod was going to Europe, particularly the Mediterranean, and certainly to Britain and whatnot, but also it was the food for enslaved people in the Caribbean. Its lowest grade would be sent there because once you packed it into the barrel and sealed it, it could withstand a lot of hot weather. And not all of it turned out well, but that was the important thing. So I'll just read you a bit about that. The circle of my knowledge expanded when I traveled to Scotland. Those sugar plantations in the West Indies, they were hellholes where the second son of a wealthy Scots family or one had needed his own start could make his fortune and maybe even a peerage. Many is the plantation owner or trader from Glasgow who made, quote, a nationally significant fortune during the golden days of sugar. Salt cod to slaves to sugar, all part of the system. And you can see this painting from the early 1800s of a sugar plantation in the British West Indies. So this is getting to be some found history over there. And the Scots were actually the major plantation owners. It really made the city of Glasgow. It made a lot of people very, very rich. And it's sort of coming out of the woodwork a little bit, and people are coming to terms with that. There's a book called Slavery and Highlanders. Might be the other way around, that pretty much names any major Scots family name you can think of as somehow being implicated in the trade, maybe, building slave ships or running plantations or whatever it is. So during this time, the salt fish, the price for the fish was based on the grade of it, how good it was. So there was something like 48 grades in mid-19th century Newfoundland and grades and classifications of Newfoundland salt cod fish. And here is something that I got from the archives. And this is some of the grades and classifications. And they're very specific, and they would stamp on the barrel the grade and where it was going to and where it was from. And that's how they would be priced. So you could see that the women's work was really important because the quality is what made it. And I'll just read you a couple of these so you can see what they're like. Bankfish caught on Grand Bank. Choice Spanish, sound quality, extra thick, light amber color, and somewhat translucent in appearance, even surface well split, thoroughly clean on back and face, showing no salt or stains, 7/8 stride. Very particular grading coming through. Third, slight signs of excessive salt, unbroken or only slightly broken, slightly sunburnt with no sign of slime, hard drive. And then the West Indian grade, broken, but not excessively, sunburnt, oversalted, slightly slimy or done, hard dried. So you get a sense of that. So one of the poems I wrote tries to bring this all together. And I call it North Atlantic Fracture Zones. Under the North Atlantic's deep water, a landscape lies, a geography of fracture zones in the seabed, unseen by immigrants from the highlands, riding rough seas to the unknowns of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Where there work nae better than slaves on other boats steaming from the Grand Banks or down from the Labrador to the land crew of women and children toiling on the flakes, all for the making of salt cod. Barrels of it, the best grade hauled overseas to Europe or the cheapest to the Indies to feed black slaves owned by Glasgow merchants getting fat on sugar. Aye, many fractures there are. In the north, the Charlie Gibbs fracture zone, and farther south, the Oceanographer fracture, the Atlantis, the Cane, the Vima, the Doldrums. There is the goodbye to the land of ancestors fracture. Your mum dying while at sea fracture. The lash of the overseer's whip fracturing flesh from bone. The hand caught between dory and schooner offloading fish. The hauling block upside the back of the head on a rogue wave. The machete lopping off an arm caught in the sugar mill. The fractures of a life, lives lost to struggle and short pay. And running north and south down the middle of the Atlantic, of the ocean for 10,000 miles, The great mid-Atlantic ridge crosses the fractures that bind Europe and North America, Africa and Indies, east of, west of, before, after. And on this page is where I start the timeline. So we have a timeline running through some of the book. And it's Linda Buckmaster's timeline. I mean, these are factual times, but it's all based about what interests me about what was going on simultaneously in all these three places in Europe, North America, and the West Indies, especially involving, enslaved people and money. So yes, many nerdy things that some of us really like, but you can see how I needed to give a lot of information before you would even know what that poem was really talking about. Another poem I did is what's called a found poem. Oops, I'm in the wrong section. A found poem. So a found poem is something that you've read or heard or watched, and you're just lifting this material up, rearranging it into making a new poem. And I had read a couple of oral histories from the 20th century of women who worked in the fisheries, certainly in the fish plants, but a lot of these women were old enough that they had done this work on the flakes of running sauerkraut. So I read two oral histories. I was going to write about it in an essay, and I thought, I can't say it any better than them. So I wrote Beach Woman, and this is a longer piece, and I'm just going to read some lines from it. Beach Women, a found poem in the voices of Louise, Violet, Agnes, and Nellie. I was here on Grand Bank and went working at fish down on the beach. You had to go on the beach to earn a few dollars, do the best you could to make ends meet. Everybody was after number one fish. You get more for making number one fish than you would for getting the seconds. I wasn't very old when I started cutting sounds off the bones and taking all the black off. I was carrying a baby. Hard work on the beach like that, so much bending over. I always think that's the reason Emma was the shortest in the family. When the pile got so high, we used to make it up almost like a sharp roof, like a peak on a house. This was a real art and had to be done just right or it didn't suit. Everybody was going full tilt, bringing fish in and yaffling up fish. I was no more than about 10 or 11. I'd be jigging fish while Dad would be hauling his trawl. I had 9 quintals of fish that summer. I kept my fish to myself and sold it. I had my sleeve worn right out, taking the fish they used to bring me. Then every night, stars in the sky, you'd take your 2 buckets and bring in a barrel of water for the next day. Beat tired, see. So I also have short stories in here, short stories. One of which, the very first one, I actually wrote a good 20 years ago. So even before I was consciously working on this project, I had this interest, right? And the first one's about a Maine saltwater farm and a found baby, a foundling on the beach, very mysterious baby, which is a common trope across both sides of the Atlantic. This baby that shows up, right? So it could be from a storm or could be something like that, frequently an illegitimate child or something. So it was interesting. There's several of them over in Scotland I ran across, and even in Iceland, I heard one just recently.
Found babies in Iceland?
Yeah, a long time ago. Foundlings.
Like actual babies.
Actual babies. So So they might not have been there very long. They were placed by someone and then someone else got the idea. So I wasn't going to read that story, but maybe I'll read a part of it so you can get the idea. Okay, so this is called Rose Autumn, Campbell Harbor, Maine, 1858. So Mother and Margaret and Rose, no, name just escaped me. The other daughter, they're cleaning out the cellar, and Mother sits down to tell this story because Mother grew up on the island. So I'll just read it. Okay. We didn't have too many visitors from off island, especially in winter. Summer was a different story. The Indians came through and camped a night or two on the beach while they gathered clams and fished. They sold us baskets they had made over the winter. That's where our baskets came from. The midwife came when someone was lying in or was very ill, if weather allowed, and certain men from the village on the mainland stopped by to catch up on the news when they were fishing nearby. Women folk from the other islands sailed over for a few days' visit. When one of the big girls got to be marrying age, young men started visiting regularly, and they would have to visit with everyone. The best visitor was Mrs. Meredith, the granny woman who came in the fall. She rode over quite a distance, really, on a clear, flat day after the first frost to pick rose hips. On the north side of our island, we had the biggest, brightest hips of anywhere, she said. We called Mrs. Meredith the granny woman because she was older than most everyone around, and she knew so many things. She could turn a backwards baby in the room, and she was just the best at relieving all kinds of troubles. She kept to her gardens except when she was called to set up with someone. Her husband has died long before most people on the island had been born, and her children were scattered to Ohio and farther west than that. So that's the historical life of Maine. When she came to our island, she stayed at each of the houses in turn, and the children waited feverishly for their visit. And I'll skip ahead. So on this particular visit, she stayed the first night with the Lithgows, since the eldest girl, Sarah, had been feeling poorly. We didn't know what was wrong with the girl, but she lay to bed 3 days. The next day, Mrs. Meredith came to our house with her traveling bundle in a basket. I just lost my space. After dinner, she said no time could be lost because she suspected there were a powerful lot of hips that year. We started out picking up women at each household and turned off the road that ran along our side of the island. We made our way through the deer path in the brush. Sticky seeds clung to our skirts, and we had to be careful not to get snagged by the blackberries, which had a few dried and sour berries here and there. Before long, the brush opened up and we could see the ocean. Now, the north side of our island was a high, windy place where you could look for boats on a clear day. A few had run aground on the rocks below the headland when I was a girl, and one time the body of an unknown sailor washed ashore. You couldn't safely land a boat there. It was so rough and rocky, but if you sailed east along the headlands for a ways, you'd find a snug cove with a pebble beach. Mrs. Meredith said we would follow the headland until the path dropped down to the beach where we would start picking. It was steep, and Lila, my littlest sister, ran ahead like a boy, so that my mother called her back. As she always did, she paid no mind and was soon out of sight. It was much quieter without her, and we could hear the little birds in the brush. Soon we heard Lila call her. We dropped our things and ran toward her as fast as our skirts would allow. We realized we weren't just hearing her voice, but the cries of a baby, a very new baby. There's more to that. I'll read one. Let's see, I'm going to read a different point of view here. Women's life. How are we doing? Okay. So this is kind of a composite, short story, flash fiction, we might call it. The smell of him. A fishing community, 1952. He smelled of fish and more fish, sharp as an unexpected slap. He smelled of today's fish, yesterday's and last week's, the fish of seasons stretching back decades, his own few and those of his father and grandfather and some father before that. Fresh curry or dried rot, it didn't matter. It was still a smell that would make a flatlander's stomach heave like a punt on a quartering wave. Layers of days and nights, hauling, offloading, heading, gutting, scooping the stinking liver out and dropping it into the gunk hole. He wore the stink of diesel and used engine oil. He smelled of sour muskiness, of moldering hair and clothes long unwashed and crusted with salt. He carried the stink of soot, tarry rope, and burned things. To her, he smelled like a life she didn't want. The smell of fish mingled with birthing blood and yeasty dough rising and baby vomit and trouble. The stink of her parents' house mingled with the sweet and funky tang of wood smoke, as if there was something wild out there she just might be able to have. She knew the odor of musky sex as she had smelled on her mother as she put the pre-dawn kettle on for her husband's tea before he left for the dock. She knew the smell of milk gone sour, curdling flesh wound, brother's sweat at the table, her own skin smelling the same as salt cod drying on the flake. She knew the sickening sweetness of mold and rot. Most of all, she knew the smell of poverty. She didn't want that life. She knew it stank. But still the smell of him pulled her in. It hung all around him like a quilt she just might like to pull over herself. She stepped in closer, inches from his half smile and hooded eyes. She took a good deep breath, and with a jerk of her head, she said, "Hey, fisherman." I'm going to read you just a part of this one story. It has two parts to it. Colin and the Codfish. And I had started the first part in my terrible Scots dialect, but I'm standing by it. Because I've been reading some poetry. Remember how we talked about how I get an inspiration for poetry, written in dialect with the word gleisy in it. And gleisy means bright, watery sunshine in Gaelic. And that just grabbed me, and I wanted to use the word. So I wrote the first sentence, and by the second sentence, you'll see what happened. And excuse my accent, I'm sticking by it. It's the day after the biggest storm in November so far, and the sky and beach are all gleisy and sulky, like a bairn's tantrum cooling down. We find his body near the old dock, just like we knew he would, all in good time, stranded just as Colin was always afraid he would be. His face, you would not know after these months, but we knew his red hair stuck up straight with salt and the belt he had made for himself out of the cow that went o'er the cliff. His legs looked about the same laying down. That night, when we were on the boat after emptying the traps, he tells us he's more afraid of being stranded on some bare-ass piece of rock than drowned. So we drop him on Drury's Rock 10 miles out just for a laugh, him and his cups, but it's still an effort for the three of us to get him over the side. The water is low, and he has 2 hours till it laps that pimple head at high tide. Robbie throws her in gear and we roar off laughing, Colin jumping up and down so high that when his short leg lands a second after the regular one, it throws him a bit to starboard. That makes us laugh more, and we come back to circle around the rock a couple times and watch him before we leave. Next morning we go out after him, and he's standing straight as can be on the top of the rock. He steps aboard without a word, gets the seal gun out of the forecastle, and shoots Robbie in the head twice. His own brother, who, truth be told, hounded and tortured and tricked the boy his whole life on account of his short leg. And we, his cousins, well, we done the same to Robbie, mostly for having a peaty brother with a short leg. Colin steps out of the boat with the gun, firing at it as we take off, Robbie bleeding out. It's just for a bit of fun, says Andy. Now here we are again, except Robbie, Colin stranded and drowned on a sliver of beachy sand between two rocks, surrounded by his friends and Sitch, all the day all glazy, gone cold. 2. To say Colin can hardly believe his eyes would be accurate. Of course, he is cold and starving and wet straight through, and now a murderer to boot. It has been 5 nights since they dropped him on Drury's Rock, and he knows no one is coming back for him, or if they do, it will be straight to the gallows. The rock is just big enough at high tide to be able to take one step to the other side and piss off it. Not that he's doing very much of that now. At dead low, he can walk 15 paces in either direction from the top. He had chewed on a little rockweed to take away the hunger, but it made him more thirsty, so's he might go mad on account of it. He done what he could with the limpets that had been clinging to the rock. Haven't harvested these since I was a wee one, he thinks, for me mother's soup pot. Drury's has always meant coming home after a long haul, just visible enough most times to signal the turn toward the mainland and another 10 miles to the harbor. He looks in that direction, home, but it does him no good. He keeps thinking he should just step off the rock and be done with it. Wouldn't take long, half-hour at most in that water, and he can't swim. Better than a long, slow wait, he says to himself, sitting here exposed like seabird eggs in a cliff nest. But he can't make himself do it after a lifetime of avoiding just that. He has his knife still at his side, and he knows how to handle it. One quick slash was how he always did it. His hand would be fast across his throat. Be dead afore I felt it. He'd have to do it while he was still able. And now this. He can hardly believe his eyes, but he's ready to believe everything or nothing at this point. So when a codfish appears in the water before him, as if it were a man standing straight up, and when it says of all things, my good man, Colin just stares at it with that 100-yard stare. It's no small fish, or even an average one. That's a fair-sized fish, Colin tells no one. Must be 20 pounds, bigger than the one Robbie jigged off the dock that time. At the thought of Robbie, Colin forgets the cod. He bows his head. Robbie were a good fisherman. And then he comes back to himself and the fish and how to catch it. My good man, the damn fish says again, you've no chance to make dinner of me such as you are. Of course, that makes Colin more determined, and he slides the knife from its sheath. Fishy says, like a mother scolding a child. I can do something better for you. Something where you won't be needing food nor drink, and only the sweetest of memories will fill your mind. If you climb onto my back and place your hands gently on my dorsal fins, I will take you for a wonderful ride beneath the seas. You'll see the whole of the North Atlantic and the crystal southern waters. Now, Colin has heard about the fairies and selkies who trick humans into going with them so as they were never normal again, but he had never heard of a codfish doing the same. What's the deal, he said. No deal. The water will freeze me. It won't. I can't swim. Assumed. Bloody hell, Colin thinks. Maybe he's getting me for all of his mates I've killed and gutted. Quickly, says the fish, but soon the tide will be too low. Bloody hell, Colin thinks again. But I have always wondered what it looks like under the surface. One more thing, Colin says. At the end of this ride, you'll drop me by the beach near the old dock. Will do. That'll make them boys stand up and take notice, and he gives the cod a wink. So the story goes on. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Those hard little chairs, or maybe at home you're nice and comfy. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, and if anyone on Zoom has any questions, you can type them into the chat and I will read them out loud. Oh, we have a question on Zoom.
Okay.
Someone asks, when did you first become interested in cod?
I have to tell you, I don't really care about cod that much, and I don't really like salted fish, but I'm interested in the interaction with the people, and that's how I got kind of obsessed with it. As I told you, I had some stuff floating around, and I realized that about the North Atlantic, and lives there, like Mother and on the island, and I realized I need something to tie it together, and I thought, well, a fish. And I thought initially it was going to be salmon, because of course salmon's on both sides, although the salmon move much more than the cod do. And then because of the Newfoundland thing, I thought cod. And then I realized, I needed to narrow it even more to that salt cod. So that's how I got into cod. Yeah.
I come from a schooner sailing background.
You do?
I do, yeah, and we have only a few Grand Banks fishing schooners that were from Gloucester left. Have
Right.
you been sailing on any of them?
I have not, but of course we know them from here.
Yeah.
But I've seen them at some of the big events. So what's your experience?
Well, I've never been on a Grand Banks schooner.
Yeah.
I know they were the best schooners built.
Right.
But I work on the windjammers down
Yeah,
here, and I've
yeah.
worked up and down the East Coast.
Yeah.
On schooners, so there's a soft spot
Right,
for
right.
the schooner fishery and
Yeah.
the boats that were built because of that, so.
Well, they didn't, they originally, when they were starting to do even this offshore fishing, and in Iceland was like, whoa. Open boats, right? They're called sixereens. Sixereen, both in Iceland and in Scotland. Open boats, low freeboard. So it has 6 rowing stations and no cover of any kind. And they would row out, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, fill the boat and come back. They lost a lot of fishermen, as you can imagine. And it wasn't until later that they even started covering the deck. But then when they picked up on the schooner thing. So the Portuguese really perfected the whole dory fishing. And they had what was called the white fleet. The boats were all white. And the last of them, and you can look this up, you'll see it. There's like good YouTube on this, was 1965, was decommissioned in that they were still doing that. And of course, then the big trawlers were taking over and they were out there, which led to the moratorium kind of thing. Oh yeah, good, great. Yeah, I have not been on one. I don't know if you've been to the Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, but also their archives are all available online, and they have some of these boats under sail. It's pretty magnificent.
Have you seen the movie Captain's Courageous? The one that was made in 37 after.
I saw part of it, yeah.
Yeah, it has some really
I know.
Grand Banks fishing schooner sail.
Yeah. There's some footage of, it's the 1960s, and it's there. I don't think they're in Lisbon. I think they're in Porto. The whole town is out on the docks, and the mothers are crying. And one old man said, after 8 years old, I never had a summer. He went out on the banks at 8 years old. I think, yeah. Any other questions?
I'm wondering about your historical research process for your poems and short stories and fiction that take place back in time.
Right.
And they're so rich in their details, even like, all the smells. What's your process for getting that like sensorial research?
Right. Well, it's funny because Cynthia and I are in a fiction group together, and we're talking about research. So it's my deep reading that I've done over the years that really sparked this whole interest, and in the characters and in the lifestyle. I'm going a little digressing here. My big part of my professional life, I worked for an organization called Women Work in Community, and I was adjunct faculty at the University of Maine, Augusta, which is commuter school. So, I'm being connected to the lives of working class people. Most of the people at that point at UMA were first generation college students. So, and working myself, being a working gal myself, so I have an affinity for that. So that was interesting. So it was mostly reading fiction and poetry that got me into it. And then, the little nerdy part of me. So I do what our state poet laureate currently, Julia Bosma, calls poets research. And I describe that as going after shiny or dark objects in an unsystematic manner. So it's not, although I'm a bit of an academic, I'm not pursuing in that kind of way. And I just got back from this trip to the Shetlands and Iceland. I bought 12 books, all of which I knew I couldn't get here, that just kind of feed that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I'd love to see your library of all these books.
Well, and in the back of this book, I actually have what I'm calling a very select book list from the North Atlantic, and I've divided up between Europe and North America. Things that really influenced it, of all, poetry, prose, and nonfiction. That's really done that. And I like to pick out the weird little things that you see in a one-off in some store, like this particular one. Let's see, let me just get the full name here. Just One Interloper After Another, an unabridged, unofficial, unauthorized history of the Labrador Straits by David J. Whalen. Stapled and mimeographed off, great stuff. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, also, there's another image that you wanted to share.
That's true. So the next part of the project is I'm doing an installation. I'm not sure exactly where I came up with this idea. That will be 8 panels drawn from the imagery and the text of the book. And you'll see on the side, there'll be longer text things, and each one will have a key quote there. That's what it'll look like in the Belfast Free Library. And then if you go up, you'll see, and of course it's coming right off. The same designer, Lori Harley. And that's what's going to be my focus this summer, because
When will that be?
it will be in the Belfast Library in October. It'll be in the Rockport Library in February. And I'm looking for other libraries. I hate to say this out loud, but I've applied for a Maine Arts Commission grant to take it up and down the coast.
Wow.
And I say in that grant that my audience, right? They always want to know who your audience is. So my audience, I said, are people who don't go to literary readings and don't go to art openings. But when they come into the library with their kid, or they go into town hall, pay their taxes, they'll see these things. And so, so I got my work cut out for me. So that's
Exciting.
Yeah, it is. And she doesn't do a beautiful job. Yeah. We've had a great collaboration.
Have you collaborated with other projects?
I have, but nothing so in depth. I've done things for the Belfast Poetry Festival with visual artists or performing artists, and overseas I've done that too, but those were one-offs. But we just really clicked. She's done other friends' books, and so we just hit it off, and it worked out well. So we're going to keep going with it.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah. I had another question about your traveling, because we've been emailing back and forth, and you're like, well, I'm in Iceland now, and now I'm in Scotland, and now I'm over here.
Yeah.
So how do you, what kind of drives where you decide to go when? Is it just like something that sparks your interest, or you want to learn more about specific?
All of those, all of the above. And of course, I've been traveling for a while now, but I've really focused on, I can't wait to go to Greenland.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really I'm on the north for some reason or another. So I got tuned in because I had a couple of residencies in Portugal on the Portuguese scene. I also had the background from National Fisherman, and I knew I wanted to go to Scotland. And once I got there, I had a residency there. It's called Cove Park, and you know, we had our little apartments in shipping containers that were redone. It was very great. But there was the big house on the hill where the shared kitchen was, and it had a great library, both art and writing. So these were visual artists and a couple of writers. And it was completely unorganized. And every evening I would just go and pull 3 or 4 books off. And that's where I learned about the whole Glasgow connection. And so, you know, that one thing led to another in those kinds of things. And then we went to Ullapool and learned that that was where the first, so you remember the clearances from history, right? When they lost to the British in 1774, pretty sure about that date, maybe 72, at the Battle of Cullodoon, then all the monarchy gave all these vast pieces of land to the gentry who wanted to raise sheep and kicked all the people off that had always lived there. So the many boats coming to North America. And the first one was the Hector out of this little town of Ullapool I knew nothing about till I got there, and had a museum that was about the size of this room. And they had primary sources in little 3-ring binders. And I was reading like the diaries of some of these people. So you see how it builds in that way. So I wanted to go to the Shetlands. I was supposed to go during COVID time, because Shetlands, and if you look at the globe and look at the map from a more northern perspective, was the center of the herring and salted herring and codfish trade in the Middle Ages. And of course they're Norse and the Vikings and and then, so one thing leads to another, and that's how I went to go to Iceland, because now Iceland entered the international cod trade late in the game, because they were all out in 6 arenes rowing. They were just barely feeding their families, right? But once they got up to the next level of boats in the mid-19th century, they became a big player. Now they are the biggest player now in cod. They claim they have the world's only sustainable cod fishery. I have not really seen how they're doing that exactly, but that's what they say. That, and I guess off the Bering Sea, are the only really big commercial. So I had to go see it. Right, had to go see it. Yeah. Anything else?
I want to read the whole book now.
Okay. For those of you who would like to buy a book, you can get in touch with me. We can put this in the chat, LS Buck, all lowercase, the numeral 1 @gmail.com. So I produced this book. I'm the publisher and I'm the distributor. And also bookstores all up and down the coast actually have copies of it. So you can get it there, and you can get it at your local library.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.